So I doubt very much you would have heard of me, so just a quick overview of who I am and why I'm speaking to you today. I have a background in financial services and technology, having worked at various investment banks across quantitative research, structured derivatives, and structured bond issuance. I've done advisory work for various stock exchanges and securities depositories on pricing and competitiveness. I've done a few entrepreneurial projects from co-founding a quantitative hedge fund to CTO of a gaming company, growing from startup to successful exit in 3 years. And a year ago, I started Globacap, which has brought me firmly into the crypto space middle of last year, and apparently that makes me an expert in the crypto world. Education, no one cares about education. So I'd like to start. Today I'm talking to you about how equities can actually be real equities, full dividend and voting rights can actually be structured in blockchain. But to do that, let's start with some basics first to make sure everyone in the room is on the same page. So, blockchain. You all know, I'm sure, that you have a public key and a private key. The public key is like your address, the street address of your house. Everybody knows where you live, or they can find out where you live. The private key is the actual key to the front door. Only you can unlock that key, and you shouldn't really share that key, and if you do, sometimes maybe you regret it. Both of those two combine with one-way mathematical function to create a signature, and that signature also has a different function that can be applied to it such that everybody knows that it came from a specific address. Great. Basic stuff. All those transactions can be put together in a block, and that block combines and is represented in a hash. Therefore, we have blocks tied together in a chain, and you cannot affect one block without affecting everything else following it in the chain. Great. Also basic stuff. Does anybody know what the nonce is? This is just a side note. If you know proof of work basically works by finding a hash that starts with a certain number of zeros. And in order to do that, you have to put a random number in this nonce field. And that's what takes the computational power that everybody talks about all the time. Because the only way to do that is by brute force and trying trillions of permutations until you find the right combination to put the right number of zeros in front. So that's all linked together. The entire block and any new transactions any new blocks that get created get distributed to all of the computers, the nodes on the network. All of those nodes are in sync, and everybody's happy. What we've just described really is Bitcoin. Then along came this guy, clearly from a different planet. He took that same concept of Bitcoin, he added some code to it, such that every new transaction, every new block that gets created can execute this code. He called it a smart contract. He also called it Ethereum. And Ethereum was so successful and so easy to create new chains on that now 92% of all of the coins or chains out there are on Ethereum. So, also basic stuff. Everyone knows what an ICO is, but let's just recap because there are two very important parts here that are going to apply to the next section of this presentation. So first of all, somebody comes along and they say, I want to create a new platform. I want to create this great new tech product. Okay, and there's a way for users of this product to interact with each other. Well, they need funding to do that. So they say, I'm going to create a new currency that can be used in this platform that's limited in quantity, and I'm only going to create a fixed number of it, and as more transactions happen on this platform, that becomes more valuable. And then investors come along and they say, hey, that's great, I'll buy into that, and I'll give you some money to fund this platform, and then we're also going to list that on several different crypto exchanges, and other investors are going to come along and pay more money for it. Fantastic process, really interesting. What's truly remarkable about this, from a financial securities point of view, is that group of investors has been a global audience, a really easy to access global audience, and those exchanges, often 4, 5, 6 different listing exchanges, that's unheard of in financial context. If you're a massive organization, you list in London Stock Exchange and you have ADRs listed in New York. That's it. So to be able to multi-list like that as a small company, that's truly revolutionary. Now, going through this process, $4 billion have been raised in 2017, or $5 billion or $6 billion, depending on who you ask. Great, impressive. Well, except that that's 0.1% of the money that's been raised via regulated means in 2017. Maybe not that impressive. I don't know if anyone here has seen the movie Wall Street. Michael Douglas. Fantastic movie. He plays this character called Gordon Gekko, and in that movie, Gordon Gekko says, greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Well, if Gordon Gekko were here, I'm pretty sure he would look at those numbers and say, regulation, for lack of a better word, is good. So that's really what we're about. We're about bringing that ICO form of capital raising into the regulated space and doing that with real equity and real debt in blockchain form. So let's move on to equity issuance now. A normal equity issuance in the UK, register the securities, register the issuance of the securities in Companies House. This is a slight misrepresentation of a certificate because Companies House doesn't create a beneficial owner list. It only records the number of transactions or number of equities outstanding. The actual beneficial owner list in the UK is stored, and in any country, is stored in a registrar. In the UK, that's primarily Crest, which is owned by Euroclear, and that's held in a centralized database. Now, what do we all know about blockchain? It's a much better form of a centralized database. So that can get replaced with blockchain, thereby creating zero cost in the ongoing shareholder registry management process for a company that's issuing shares. That's a big plus. That's a huge efficiency improvement. And the discussions that we've had with regulators so far indicate the regulators are actually on page with this arrangement. So what about custody, you say, for anybody that's familiar with financial markets? And if you're not, I'll explain that process in a minute. Well, remember that we have the public key and we also have the private key. So we still need management of that private key, because if you lose that, then in theory you lose access to those securities, those tokens that are stored in an address. Yes, but we have actually created now a customized form of a smart contract whereby if you lose that private key, we can actually rip them up and reissue them in a fully regulated way. So again, I think that problem's being solved. If not by us, then by someone else. So for those of you that don't know what custody is, and generally, let's go through the issuance process. Sorry, not the issuance process, the full life cycle of trading, from trading to clearing to settlement. Because this is where blockchain can really revolutionize things. So if we have person or fund A buying securities, let's say they're buying some BT shares. Person or fund B selling those shares. Those entities will both go to their respective brokers. That could be an online account, or it could be a traditional brokerage account that you walk into and sign some forms for. Those two entities interact with a trading venue. Now, for those of you that are in crypto space and not in regulated financial market space, this does not mean a crypto exchange. The difference being that a regulated trading venue cannot hold any client assets. It is purely an order book, as opposed to a crypto exchange like a GDAX or Coinbase or a Bitrex or any others, where they actually hold your assets and you have 100% counterparty risk to them. That doesn't work in a regulated context. In a regulated context, that is just a matching venue. So when the trade gets matched, that trade then gets novated to a clearing counterparty, such as a Euroclear. And what the clearing counterparty does basically says that broker B in this case actually has the securities to be able to deliver them, because broker B is market making all day long and they buy and sell securities, and maybe at that point in time they don't actually have the securities on hand. So the clearing counterparty will go into the market, they'll buy the securities, they'll use the margin that broker B has to place with them in order to cover any difference in costs. When the clearing counterparty is happy with that, they'll pass it on to the Central Securities Depository. And the CSD will then, so the CSD, for those that you don't know, is essentially like a non-lending bank account, which custodians use to hold assets of those banks or those brokers. And the CSD, and this could be a State Street on the one hand and a Bank of New York Mellon on the other hand, but it doesn't really matter who those custodians are in this case. The CSD will engage in this process called delivery versus payment, which all that means is they take the securities from the Bank of New York Mellon custodian account representing broker B and put them into the State Street account, and they take the cash from the State Street account and they put them into the Bank of New York Mellon account. It sounds like a long-winded process, but it is actually relatively efficient. This whole cycle takes T+2. It has taken many years to get to this point. In equities, in bonds, it can take T+5 or T+10. And what happens here is you get charged fees by your broker, you get charged fees on both sides by the trading venue, you get charged fees on both sides by the clearing counterparty, and you get charged fees on both sides by the CSD and by the actual custodians themselves. This is a process I know very well. As I mentioned, I did some work on pricing for several of these entities. So what can blockchain do in this context? Just bear in mind, this is how every regulated financial market in the world works right now. We would still need a regulated trading venue, which is an order book that just matches trades. And we still need regulated entities that can do the KYC on the customers to ensure anti-money laundering compliance, etc. But at the trading venue level, we can essentially have the trading venue check a blockchain security for a beneficial ownership, check a blockchain currency, of which we don't have a stable currency right now, but we have potentially, we're working on a solution. We've heard other people are too. And then the trading venue can, they know straight away, they can see those blockchains, they can match trades where the beneficial owners already exist, and then publish that trade to the respective blockchains. There we go, bang. Instant settlement, no counterparty risk. The entire process downstream of CCP and CSDs and custodians and the entire layer of fees has been removed. That's a huge benefit. We're hearing custodians talk about this. We're hearing CSDs talk about this. We're hearing CPs talk about this. All of those entities don't really think that it's coming. It is coming. Regulators understand this is coming. They're starting to work towards it. And by the way, when those blockchain securities exist, multiple trading venues can interact with the same securities, unlike currently where a security has to be listed in different places and have different order books. That's a really revolutionary concept as well. So what do regulators think about this? Well, about ICOs in a regulated context generally, about that ICO form of raising. The SEC has said, as I'm sure you all know, that utility tokens must be securities now unless the platform is already up and running. So in other words, if as a person buying into a utility ICO, you cannot actually spend it immediately within the platform, then it must be a security. FINMA in Switzerland has basically said the same thing in copycat mode. Bank of China have essentially outlawed ICOs, but at the same time, they have dedicated $10 billion to funding blockchain projects, and they've actually got one which they're filing a patent on in the United States right now, which is to compress all of the information in blockchain, and apparently they're hoping to apply that to the private loan market in China. Very interesting. ESMA in Europe have said mixed reports, but they actually have a pan-European country blockchain panel, which are looking at how they can apply this in a securities context. The FCA are, in my opinion, are the most progressive in the world right now with their sandbox. A small firm called Navarra did a one-week trade finance bond in Ethereum entirely in the FCA sandbox back in November. And then France. So this is the French government, not the French regulator. The French government has said, we're looking at ways to create the legal framework such that blockchain themselves are legally binding securities. Okay, very good. But as usual, the French are late to the party. Welcome to us. So we are a capital raising platform where we've been working on making that concept a reality. Of creating legally binding securities, debt and equity securities in the form of blockchain. And essentially that means that we're applicable to regulated ICOs, and we would like to take that concept and offer it in a very easy-to-use format to mainstream SMEs. Now, we're doing a proof of concept right now to put our money where our mouth is, so to speak, whereby we are issuing 10% of our own company in the form of blockchain, full equity, full dividend and voting rights. And no, this is not a pitch for money. I'm just telling you about the process that we're going through. So we are taking investors from all over the world. Now, unlike a utility token where there is no regulation, you just take money from anywhere, in this case, you have to comply with securities laws. This is actually doing a security offering to different countries. So some of the aspects that come into that, for example, in the US, as a foreign entity, if you want to be able to market to US citizens, then you have to do a Regulation D Section C filing with the SEC, which is essentially a lot of paperwork. It's not that hard. You just have to pay lawyers to fill out some forms effectively. But there are some complications, such as the Exchange Act. So the Exchange Act says that if there are 300 or more investors, U.S.-related entities, whether that's a European person in the U.S. or an American in Europe, then that entity that has those securities has to do quarterly filings with the SEC. Now, that's not that onerous as it sounds. It just costs money. So it's fine if you're a larger company. If you're a smaller company, it starts to become difficult. So what we've done in this context to address this is actually build some restrictions within the smart contract in order to be able to, number one, monitor those all of the entities that are participants, even in the secondary market, but number two, to be able to limit transactions whereby that number might be exceeded. We're working around the same regulations in Europe and in Singapore and Hong Kong at the moment for our own issuance, and they all have their respective differences. Where we see this process really moving towards is being able to streamline that and gradually being able to unify regulation in those. We're never going to unify regulation, but being able to unify the regulatory aspect of doing certain filings and the way that issuing documents is structured in all of those contexts. So that's a quick high-level overview of what we're seeing in the market and what we're doing. And at that point, if there's time, I wanted to open up to questions.
Well, we're actually going to take a half-an-hour break, so if anyone wants to stay and ask some questions, then please do use the opportunity. We're back in here at 4 o'clock for our next presentation with me, Toro. But if you can join me and say thank you very much for the presentation, absolutely fascinating.